بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. فمن يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. ثم أما بعد السلام عليكم. I pray all is well. Of course, it's a great honor, a great privilege to be on this evening. I am excited tonight because we are beginning a new series that we're entitling, Real Talk, where we will look at, different issues, different substantive issues, and just engage a no holds barred, open, honest conversation, about, various and sundry issues. Um, the topic that was suggested for this evening was women, um, uh, generally, but I'm assuming if we were to narrow that down some, women in Islam. And I do have some conversation starters. I do have some preliminary ideas about, even the way that we have framed this topic. But first off, Randa, can I get a sense of how many people are on? Are we expecting more people, or should we just go ahead?
There's about 9 of us. I think you can go ahead. I think people will slowly start to trickle in.
Okay. My sister who proposed the topic, is she on or not yet?
She is. There is. I thought it was just me, but it's a little crackly, your audio. I'm not sure.
Okay. Let me see if I can adjust it at all. Let me see here. 1 second. Is the audio quality any better, or is it still crackly?
Slight crackling, but
Okay, maybe. I'm thinking
you're
of
still
just going.
audible though. You're still audible. It just has a.
I wanna see if I can minimize the crackling. Hold on 1 sec. Let's try this. Hold on. Okay. 1 second here. Okay. How about now?
No crackling, but you're not as loud.
No crackling, but I'm not as loud. Okay. Let's try this then. 1 second.
Okay.
Hold on. Okay. 1 second. pulling out all the stops here. So how are we now?
Okay, much better.
So no crackle, but my voice is audible.
Yes.
Okay, Bismillah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My sister that proposed this topic, I just wanted to make sure that she was on because, I expect her to participate with me in the discussion. If she wants to rebut or ask a follow-up question, I just want you to know if you want to unmute and jump in at any time. I see this as a conversation between us all, but I think your input, because obviously this topic of discussion was something very important to you, I think your input would be beneficial for all of us. So as long as I have that agreement from you, inshallah, we can go ahead and get started, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Yes. So, it's interesting. Whenever you think about topics like this, the first thing that sticks out to you, the first thing that is, just apparent to you is that it would be completely unusual to hear a talk or read a book or to hear a lecture entitled Men in Islam. You just don't hear that. In the same way that if you're talking about race in America, you're talking about Black and brown people. You're really talking about non-white people. And I think that in and of itself has to be, dissected, looked at. W.E.B. Du Bois, great race writer, the turn of the century, commenting on the color line, right? Saying, America's problem was the color line. He posed the question to white readers, do you know how it feels to be a problem? That when people talk about the problem of race, they're really just talking about what is to be done or how are we to understand Black people. Similarly, whenever there's a talk about Islam and gender, we're talking about the issue of women. And I want to say that I completely identify with the frustration that some women must feel just at being like a special issue or being a problem or being kind of this addendum to a conversation about Islamic norms. And then there's norms and there's women and norms. There's family and women and family. That in and of itself, I think is, indicative of how far we have to go as a species, by the way, not as a Muslim community, when talking about, women. The other thing that, just kind of jumped out to me in a, just planning to engage, this topic is, there are two statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him. One is a statement of the Prophet, one is an authentic hadith, right? An authentic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And the other is a verse of the Quran that, I know this is bold because, gender studies is, it's an entire discourse, right? Gender studies is, one could spend, and some do spend, an entire lifetime, studying gender, reading and researching about gender, writing about gender, teaching about gender. So I don't want to appear flippant in thinking that I can offer some neat little composite, based on two statements and think that I've understood the matter in toto. But I do think that these two statements speak to two realities that, to my mind, would frame an Islamic conversation about women. One is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, in which he said, "An-nisa'u shaqa'iqur rijal," that women are the twin halves of men, right? This statement is, of course, upholding the value of women, upholding the worthiness of women, upholding the dignity of women. An-nisa'u shaqa'iqur rijal, right? That women are the spiritual equals, that women are, this isn't conditioned spiritual.
It just says, النساء شقائق الرجال. Women are the twin halves of men, right? This is an authentic statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, you know, in addition to dignity and value and worth, equality is clearly being, you know, emphasized. You know, shaqiq is a twin brother. You say shaqiq tawam, like my twin brother. So shaqa'iq is the plural of, so it's literally women are the twins of men. So equality is being affirmed. And then you have the verse of the Quran that says, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكْرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, that the male is not like the female. And of course, this verse indicates the distinctiveness of men and women, that men are distinct creatures of God and women are distinct creatures of God. Now, interestingly enough, if we look at the background of this verse, this was mentioned to the mother of Maryam, right? Maryam's mother conceived, right? Her name was Hannah or Hannah. She conceived and she pledged what was in her womb for, you know, temple service, that the baby that she was carrying, she pledged that baby to the service of God, that this baby would be a devotee from a very early age to the true religion of God. And when the baby was born, she exclaimed, "Oh my God, this is a female child. How will I fulfill my oath?" And God said, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, the male is not like the female. But in this case, the male that she desired would never have been as good as the female that she received. We're talking Maryam, one of the best human beings, one of the people that enjoyed the closest relationship to God of anyone. So the statement is mentioned in the story of Maryam, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى. So the statement certainly is not about women being less than. It's about women being distinct and different than. Now, if you look at those two, on the one hand, equality and equity and, you know, generically sameness. And then you look on the other hand, you have difference, distinctiveness, specificity. I find that whenever any group has experienced oppression, mistreatment, discrimination, abuse at the hands of a majority group, and they don't have to be numerically the majority, but majority in terms of worldly power. And this is very important that we make this distinction, because even when we identify certain categories of people as dominant, we have to, as Muslims, I know in terms of critical theoretical study, it's very useful to identify certain people as dominant because of the wealth that they possess and the power that they possess. And by power, I mean the ability to compel people to do things against their will. That's what power is, right? When we pay our taxes, we do so because the government has power. They can compel us to do so against our will. They can garnish our wages. They can imprison us. That's power, right? Men have traditionally and contemporaneously held more societal and even within familial structures power than women. And that's why it is not incorrect to identify our society and societies before ours as patriarchal, meaning that kind of worldly power is vested in bodies that are gendered as male, right? Usually. That's patriarchy. That's that men have power. However, one of our contributions to this discourse is that we don't view privilege and power just through this kind of very Marxist, materialist lens. That yes, there are some just using race, and that analogy will come up again and again throughout these short reflections. But yes, there are, if we're talking about social economic power and political power, white communities certainly have more than Black communities in the United States of America. But if we're looking at privilege in a wider sense, if we're looking at privilege as closeness to Allah, if we're looking at privilege as closeness to nature, if we're looking at privilege as moral integrity, if we're looking at privilege as, then I'm not sure. In fact, you know, I don't want to sound bigoted myself, but I'm definitely not convinced that white communities have more of those things than Black communities. In the same way, I'm not convinced that men have ever had more of those things than women. But when we engage a social critique, we're usually engaging that critique on social terms, all right? And where that becomes problematic or where that becomes a struggle is that you have those two, poles, right? Equality, dignity, value, worth, and distinctness, specificity, difference. And often what happens when we talk about a marginalized or oppressed group is that that group usually needs to give up some of their distinctiveness, some of their specificity, some of their uniqueness to affirm their value. That's what always happens. So you have to give up. So so my equality, my value, my worth, it ends up defined on terms that you create. And you see this all the time. Again, the analogy of race will come up over and over again as we, and I only have maybe 20, 25 minutes of reflections. But, African Americans, if, for instance, I'll give you a good example of what I mean by this. If someone says, I noticed that Black people are more artistically inclined. They are, rhythmic. They are athletic and things like this. Talking about kind of, an anecdotal distinctiveness within Black people. Black people will always bristle at that because in asserting that distinctiveness, whether it's true or not, I'm not arguing, but in the fact that you're asserting that there's something distinct about me, what we hear is we're not as cerebral, we're not as intellectual, we're not as intelligent, right? So what we'll end up doing is denying that distinctiveness. That no, we're not more rhythmically inclined. We're not more athletic. We're not closer to nature. We're not more family oriented. None of that's true because what we hear in your assertion of that distinctiveness is you are disavowing or you're repudiating my worth, my equality. And I find the same thing when we're trying to talk about gender issues. If we say that women are more emotionally intelligent than men, what I think many women hear is that we're less rational. We're less logical. If we say that women have the unique ability to conceive, carry, and give birth to human life, this means, right? Now we can have a whole lecture just talking about what that means spiritually. But in the context of something like being careerist and materially driven, this could mean, right? And studies show all sorts of things, right? And I did consult a few studies in preparation for the class today. This could mean that women are, in a psychic way, more connected or connected differently to their children than men are. And because of that connection, certain kinds of professional ambition might be emotionally ill-suited, right? That it might be certain kinds of professional ambition that entail long periods of separation from their children. Women might be ill-suited for that, or that might not be something as tolerable to women as it is to men. You have many women that will fight you and say, no, I'm just as capable of a short leave and getting right back to work. And my point in mentioning that is that as Muslims, whether we're talking about race or we're talking about gender, we are trying to engage the conversation from a place that assertions of distinctiveness and uniqueness are not assertions of inadequacy and deficiency. That if I say, and many, third wave feminists have actually arrived to the place of saying the concept of gender itself is misogynistic, because what it seeks to do is say that women are distinct from men, but in that distinctiveness, it's a hierarchy that's being imposed, right? Women are distinct from men. This is why men are on top of women, right? And my argument to that is, on top, if you are limiting your assessment to the dunya, if you're limiting your assessment to the dunya, then that's a conversation. But if you're talking about as human beings, as servants of God, men are certainly not on top of women, and women have never been on top of women. Now, the reason why this is important to me as we engage this discussion, and these were just kind of some preliminary remarks and kind of trying to create a container, is that I feel that if the dignity of women is not upheld, while the distinctiveness in areas where women are distinct from men is not upheld, what we end up producing is a situation in which a woman's dignity or worth or value is only affirmed when she does something, or when she is allowed to do something that has traditionally been limited or restricted to men. Not that a man's value, a man's worth is shown, is demonstrated when he can do something that has traditionally been limited or restricted to women. See, if a woman, and this is just something I think is problematic. If a woman, I remember, years ago when Lisa Leslie, the WNBA player for the Los Angeles Sparks, when she dunked a basketball in a game, and that was a great, and she was on the cover of magazines, and it was news, and people were talking about it, and she came down. It was a fast break. They threw her the ball. She was on the wing. She took the ball and she slammed it, right? And this was like, oh my gosh, she dunked a basketball. Or if, a woman becomes a very powerful CEO of a company, or a woman leads Salatul Jummah, as in the case of Dr. Amina Wudu, or if, if a woman demonstrates her capacity or capability as a warrior, a soldier, a fighter, these are things that indicate the value of women, right? Ooh, look at what women can do, right? You see bumper stickers, fight like a girl. Look at what women can do. But if a man is able to, move past a traditionally masculine obsession with things, right? It's proven now. Men are more obsessed with things, men are more into things, and women are more into people. So if a man is able to move past an obsession with things and chart his career trajectory in a way that prioritizes his family, prioritizes his children, he doesn't end up on the front page of a magazine. Because we don't value that. If two men are able to get over a toxically masculine ethic of competition that would draw them into violently killing each other so that they can sit down and make amends with each other, they don't end up on the front page of magazines for doing that. You see? If men learn to be more receptive and not simply aggressive and proactive, nobody gives them credit for that. No one says, wow, these men are really moving toward the realization of a prophetic balance in being men. It's the, the flow is always the other way. And I worry that the flow being that way, it encourages, women to relinquish their God-given roles as leaders to men in many respects. In many respects. Unfortunately, just not the respects that society, the dunya, places value on. Unfortunately. And this is what, the German philosopher Nietzsche, talking about Christianity, of course, right? He despised Christianity. And one of the reasons he despised Christianity was that he said it represents a transvaluation of normal human values. Right? Nietzsche was brilliant in this. Religion represents a transvaluation of normal human values, by which he meant, whereas we esteem strength, religion elevates meekness. It elevates meekness. Whereas we esteem power and triumph and vainglory, and right, Nietzsche had this concept of the Übermensch, the Superman, that once we pull off the shackles of religion, we will become super, right? But Christianity, in his estimation, the last will be first. The meek shall inherit the earth. And I'm like, that's it. Faith is supposed to represent this place where, worldly values are called into question. This is what the dunya loves. Well, maybe Deen is calling us to something different than that. And I think that, the statement that for me, concluding some, just kind of my preliminary remarks about it, is that if we don't create a society in which men are encouraged to emulate women in their natural virtue, women will emulate men in their natural vice. Let me say that one more time. If we don't create a society in which men are encouraged to emulate women in their natural virtues, women will begin to emulate men in their natural vices. Right? So just to give, a very graphic example, but I really want, as I'm building out the container, and I know my sister will have some pushbacks, as I'm building out this container, I really want my message to come across clearly. So I'll use just a very vivid example that I'm sure we can all relate to. Now, this is actually a real Islamic tradition from the Prophet ﷺ, that men and women experience an interest in sexual activity in the same way. That men and women actually experience an interest in sexual activity in the same way. The reason that we see more, kind of overt displays of male sexual fantasy, whether it's sex work, pornography, promiscuity, sexual harassment, is because women have more adab. Women have more etiquette. Women have more natural shyness in maintaining a certain decorum while feeling things very deeply, that men are simply much more willing to dispense with that decorum in pursuit of the realization of their sexual aims, their sexual desires, that men will much more readily dispense with any decency, decorum in pursuit of those aims, whereas women feel the feeling as strongly, but there is more etiquette, more decorum, more shyness in pursuing, right, the realization of those aims. What the concept of haya, or modesty, is supposed to produce in men is a religious incentive to lower their gaze, to to be more like women in their shyness. And when the modesty of the Prophet ﷺ was described, right? They said he was more, and I mean, I don't want to, trigger warning, right? Some of this, like, this is very old language. And I know that there's much talk about, cults of virginity in religious communities and Muslim communities. So I don't mean to trigger anybody, but I want to quote the hadith because I'm trying to make a point that when they were describing the shyness of the Prophet, the modesty of the Prophet, they said he was more modest than a virgin on her wedding night, sitting in her chamber, right? But my point, not the description, they described this is the Prophet, right? This is the highest human ideal of virtue for Muslims. They described his modesty as being feminine. They described his shyness as being feminine when they're describing his virtue, right? So his example is one that is supposed to make men more like women. If men fail to do that, if men fail to create that as an ideal, women will begin to register their etiquette as repression. Why am I, right? And we see this in Muslim households where boys can do whatever, girls are being killed, honor killings. Why, yeah, a little bit less. It's disgusting. It's disgusting, right? If a guy has many sexual partners, this is something heroic. If a woman has many sexual partners, this is something shameful. All of these disparities, right? If women see those disparities and they see those disparities being celebrated, then what might have been a natural virtue begins to feel like a repressive yoke that needs to be shed in order to assert one's equality. That I can do it just like you. I can do that too. I can have casual, no strings attached sex just like you can. Why can't I do it? Even though that shyness, that discriminating attitude just corresponds to the fact that women bring much more to a sexual encounter than men do because of the possibility of pregnancy. So it's not even natural to have this kind of very cavalier attitude. If there's a prospect of conception, it would not be practical to have this very kind of cavalier attitude toward intercourse. But if men make that something that they esteem and not the natural virtue of women, that will give women to that. I think that will move women to give up a natural set of virtues in pursuit of their equality through natural vices. I think we see that in sex. I think we can see that in obsession with dunya. Men have always been more obsessed with dunya. Always. That's something you can count on. Violence. Men have always been more violent. Steven Pinker, from Harvard, he was talking about how, now he's dealing in statistics, right? And I don't know how, for me, the test, talking about the test in this way is offensive because it's like, okay, intelligence quotient, how is that? How does that correspond to like actual intelligence? But nonetheless, we're talking about IQs. And he was saying that the IQs of men are a little bit higher. So not like a whole order of magnitude, but now, of course, you can go into the bias involved in putting the test together. Of course you can. But look at the second part of the quote. So he was saying that, generally speaking, the scores are the same across men, women, I'm losing my statistics language, but every Ismail, are you on the call? Help me, man. Every
cohort, stratum.
Every stratum is the same, except when you get into like the extreme geniuses. When you get into the extreme geniuses, the people that are off the charts, there's more men than women. Everywhere else, men and women are the same. When you get to the extreme geniuses, right, supposedly, there's more men there than women. But he also mentioned that you have much more psychopathy, psychopaths, sociopaths, etc., among men than women. You see, we don't see. So, there are certain kinds of, social maladies that, women have not been affected by in the same way that men have. And I think that, spiritually, many Muslim scholars, they say that there has never been a woman on record, right? You'll find this in a lot of the Sufi literature when they're talking about the virtue, the inherent virtue of women, that there has never been a woman that says, "And Allah, I'm God." Never. We don't have that in recorded history. People worship goddesses, but but you have Fir'aun. You have, many men over history that have claimed to be Allah. I'm God. So no, women don't do that. It's not, right? These are virtues. Now, that said, as I move toward my summary, I am not in any way saying that some of those things traditionally associated with males or maleness are restricted to women. Not at all. I think, in fact, I think even in those things, in those fields, I think we need to be very open to the influence of women. But when I say we have to be very open to the influence of women in business, in our business cultures, in our politics, certainly in our cultures of combat, military engagement, I think there will be more peace. I think we will be more balanced. I think we'd be a more holistic society. I think our society will be healthier for children. I think it will be better for all of us. But when I say that, I'm actually taking for granted that women can bring something distinct to how we understand those fields of endeavor. Not that they can just come in and do what the men do as well as they do. I actually think that there would be no purpose in that. If a woman can show that she can push the button just as quickly as a man, she can pull her gun and shoot just as quickly as a male officer. Or I actually think that there would be no utility in that. I think honestly, it is a lot of attitudes that I identify with maleness that I think that's what's absolutely wrong with the world. That's what's wrong with the world. Too much violence, too much competition, too much association with things. Too much. And I think that if we open those public fields of endeavor and human activity to the influence of women as a distinct influence, we will be better for it. So أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. That's what I had on those are just some of my thoughts about the issue. But if anybody wants to follow up, rebut, push back, I'm here for it.
I have a question.
Yes.
So first of all, I really appreciate the prelude, and I think there's a lot there to process, and it would probably take some time to do that. But I think that there were a lot of thoughts there to go off of. So just starting at the beginning and what you started off with. So if our intentionality is correct, then we know that God intends no hardship for us, and that there is inequality in a certain sense, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But we also know that where we are at is not where we should be. So
Yes.
it's a matter. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I'm just agreeing with you.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's a matter of bridging that gap, right? And it's a matter of figuring out what variables fall into that. And I think that there's, I completely agree with you. This is a really complex issue, and some of it honestly probably does go beyond the scope of this class. But I would like to start with one of the variables that I think is at issue here, or that that maybe we just don't know enough about. And I think that would be our ulama, our scholars. So I think I'd like to know why this discussion is so necessary. Why does this have to be a controversial issue? So I've been at many different forums, and I've seen someone sort of venture up the courage and ask a question, about women in Islam. And this is, this has been in the US, in this country. And I've seen the responses from our scholars. And I just, to be full disclosure, are male scholars, right? So I've seen everything from, let me say this, that I understand that even though our scholars are tasked with the enormous charge of preaching a message of perfection, it does not mean that they themselves are perfect. And we all, we understand that we give people leeway. It's what our deen requires, right? But I've seen everything from dismissiveness to hostility to questions regarding women. And I honestly think this is the one and only forum where I haven't seen that, where I've seen this issue been given its due deference and been treated sensitively. So I guess I'd like to know, since you're a member of this cohort and, you're part of that community, why do you think that this is such a controversial topic? And why isn't it discussed more? Do you think it should be discussed more? Do you think it should be discussed less? What best practices would you advocate for your peers?
A very good question. And honestly, I think much of what I've seen, I think it really comes down to insecurity. Muslim scholars have been given the enormous task of trying to speak about a religious tradition that maintains its, I don't like the word superiority, but maintains its superior value in terms of human systems of living. However, they're trying to do so in a context in which there is a dominant norm, and we should say clearly it's a Western norm. There's a dominant norm that sometimes the tradition is not being able to define itself on its own terms. It's being asked to define itself on, I think, what those scholars probably perceive as someone else's terms. Meaning, like, and what's strange about that, I mean, because I don't want you to think I'm explaining this away. I actually agree with you, totally. But being a part of some of those discussions and sitting in, some of those rooms, I think people are a little vexed that Muslim gender norms are never given space just to kind of like define themselves. They're always compared to what are usually presented as progressive gender norms. So it's like, where are you on this issue? And I think that the scholars, if they're not if they're not deeply learned, I think they're frustrated because they feel like they're between a half dozen and six. They feel like, on the one hand, I have to admit that you are either overtly or covertly suggesting that there is a relationship to gender that is more evolved, that is morally more mature than what you think I represent as a traditional scholar. Either I'd have to just admit that, or I would need the time to explain how my understanding of gender is a part of a larger kind of system of values, and that within that system of values, my understanding of gender makes sense and is not in any way inimical to women. But if I don't have the ability to do that, or I don't have the time to do that, or the questioner does not appear interested in me doing that, I usually just get frustrated, not me, but if I'm like that traditional scholar kind of person, I just get frustrated, dismissive, angry, defensive, because I feel defeated. You know, I think that what I think is lost in some of that analysis of those scholars is that they actually don't want to admit that progressive values with regard to gender are better than Islamic ones. See, they don't want to admit that. They don't, because they feel like in the deen in the law of Islam. They feel like, no, the religion with God is Islam. Islam is good. And I feel like I don't have the words or the tools or the ability to show that Islam is good while maintaining the integrity of the tradition. And so it just makes me frustrated. It just makes me angry because they can't say, well, of course, progressive values are better than our values. You know, we're just holding on to these because we think they're divinely inspired in some way. But in terms of liberty, in terms of justice, in terms of equity, in terms of fairness, in terms of empowerment, in terms of self-actualization, yeah, progressive values are better than our values. They are. No, of course, of course, they don't want to say that. But I think, they just, I haven't seen a lot of scholars that possess the ability to kind of self-define, as it were. And on the other side of it, I haven't seen a lot of, questioners that are really interested in that self-definition. A lot of times the question is quite loaded, like, and even in that the question being loaded, Muslim communities are never compared to other religious communities. So it's not like, female-led prayer, the ordination of women priests in the Catholic Church. No. It's like, this woman is the CEO of a company. If she became Muslim, she couldn't even lead the Salat al-Jum'ah. What's up with that? And I think that's like, it's like, I think it's a very challenging discussion for those ulama. Now, to your point, I'm going to say the same thing that you said. Some of those men, although scholars, and some of those women, perhaps, although scholars, I think have a very inadequate view of women in Islam, have a very erroneous view of women in Islam, have a very misogynistic view of women in Islam, have a very limited view of women in Islam. And sometimes when they speak, they show their, personal limitations and hangups. And I think that as a community, we have to, kind of know that we're not bound by their limitations and hangups, with regard to what they believe, women are capable of, or what women should be doing, or what, women can do. None of those are my arguments about capacity, capability, competence. I just argue for distinctiveness. I don't want women to conflate capacity, capability, competence with doing things in traditionally male ways, right? But in terms of women entering those fields, absolutely. I think we all stand to benefit from that. But enter as what? Well, they said the men and women are not the same, right? My wife and I don't think about life in the same way. When we're thinking about our children, I'm thinking about college funds. She's thinking about their emotional intactness. We need both perspectives in order for there to be balance. If I'm thinking about the dunya, she's thinking about the dunya, what happens to the emotional intactness of my children? You see? So I'm not talking about women having a role that is less than. I'm talking about being able to say women have a role that is equal to but different. And I just find that, many of the scholars, are just not there in terms of the discourse. And I'm willing to give them some time to adjust, because in many parts of the majority Muslim world, I mean, they're really just coming out of the cellar. Part of the colonial enterprise, we have to empathize with them, was to discredit the scholars, to completely discredit them. And that's by design. When you have a religious tradition, the scholars become the human embodiments of kind of the old order, the old way of understanding, the old way of knowing, the old way of doing. And if you want to implement a newer, quote unquote, superior way of knowing, way of doing, of course, the newer and superior way of knowing and doing is one that privileges you, right? It's a self-serving, other obliterating criterion. But one of the ways that you do that, you discredit the scholars. And this is why in a lot of, majority Muslim, countries, the scholars went from being the most esteemed of people to the jokes, the laughing stocks, the good for nothing, the ga'idi, right? Mulisa, that idiot, that religious twit, that small-minded, narrow-minded, right? And I think a lot of the scholars have lived with that literal scorn and contempt that the upper echelons of Muslim society had toward them, for a very long time. And I think that you see a lot of that insecurity in them, and it's not our problem, but I think it is something, that's important for us to identify. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, I think it helps a lot. Thank you. I appreciate you constructively critiquing your peers, and I think, God willing, the effect will be that it'll make them come across as more human rather than as like these malevolent patriarchs or whatever. But I do have a follow-up question on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget the exact words you used, but you labeled them in many different ways, and you followed up by saying that it doesn't affect us. But I think I would push back on that. It does feel like it does affect us. It affects our institutions, including our masajid. It also, creates a sort of socially creates some issues. And I think it also, perhaps most importantly, I think one of the things I wonder about is how much does it affect the rulings that are passed down to us, right? So we know on one hand that Islam is a religion of orthodoxy, but on the other hand, it is a message for mankind and therefore inherently dynamic. And it's a hard balance to reach. And I think the question is, how do we know that these rulings from these, humans, like everyone else, flawed humans who may have patriarchal notion and, who may have, come from places that just don't promote some of the values that we have. How do you reconcile that? How do we know, for example, take one of the many, many, many rulings that disparately impact women, right? Everything from hijab to not being able to marry men of the book to, not leading in Jummah prayers. Like how do we know that our deen isn't being affected? Because it's one thing, for there to be mistakes made and things passed on that we need to work on, but it's entirely different thing if this is affecting my way of worship, if it's infringing on my role.
Bismillah. No, I'm absolutely sensitive to that, and I think two things that I want to point out here. One, rulings that are handed down from the past should be under constant scrutiny and review. Sometimes in the name of orthodoxy, you really have history masquerading as religion. You have something that is really just historical. It's almost, the most vivid, and sometimes, communities are conscious of it. But for me, the most vivid example of history kind of becoming religious, as it were, is like Hasidic Jews. You see them with like the overcoat and the hat, and the side braids are actually rooted in the scripture, and sometimes the long sock and the shoe. This was just Eastern European dress, at the time that community was coming into formation. It's not like that is somehow being thought of as like the Sunnah of Musa, like Moses wore like a high brim hat, and Moses wore like a top coat, and it was just historical. But the Hasidic community has held on to that form of dress from that distinct historical period, so much so that now it has religious value. Like now, that's religious. That's something associated with their Judaism. And I think Muslims are often guilty, maybe in ways that are not as clear of the same thing. Things that like, you read a book of, Muslim law, and something that was just completely just temporal and chronologically correct becomes like a religious, like we're still doing this in 2020. That's a problem. That's a problem. That is unwise, stupid, and I usually don't use the word stupid, but I'm using the word stupid in conscience. That's unwise, stupid religious scholarship. And to the surprise of many of the people that do that, many Muslim scholars have talked about how the person that does that is more dangerous than a bad, ill-trained physician, which we normally call a quack. He said, this person is like the religious equivalent to a quack. He said the reason he's worse is because the most a quack can do is destroy your body. This person can destroy your body, and he can I gotta give the quote its elegance. The worst thing a quack can do is destroy your life with his bad medical advice. This person can destroy your life and your afterlife. This is why he's worse, right? So yeah, I agree with you in terms of rulings being under constant review to make sure that they are delivering what we call the objectives of the Sharia, the maqasid of Sharia. Like the Sharia is supposed to lead to, justice, right? It's supposed to lead to, equity, and it's supposed to lead to fairness. It's supposed to lead to the preservation of religion. It's supposed to lead to, any number of goals that even now as, moderns and Western moderns, we would identify with. The issue becomes, and this is where kind of we get into some difference, even among scholars that are sensitive to what we call the changing of the kind of the dynamism of rulings. How are we defining justice? How are we looking at rulings that have impacted implications that, are sensitive to the idea of gender difference? So I'll use an example here. I'll use two examples. One is, and I'll use the more easily understood one first, and then the second one will probably be more controversial. So the more easily understood ruling is the ruling of women traveling with, the issue of women traveling with a male guardian, right? That women, if they are, going on a journey that is an overnight journey, not like a trip, but an overnight, they're traveling, right? Women are traveling. There's this ruling in Islamic law that they should be, escorted by some kind of male chaperone, a husband or a male relative, right? Son, brother, father, someone like that. Now, I can totally see how something like that just sounds so anachronistic, and like it just and it associates if we're going to be blunt, femininity with a certain kind of vulnerability that, women are more vulnerable to attack and assault and more needing of protection than a male, right? Now, on the one hand, many modern scholars, they say that the accessibility of police, 911, security in airports, things like this, yaqumu maqam al-mahram. So it takes the place of a chaperone. So many scholars are of the opinion that women can travel freely without chaperones in this modern context because the protection that the law aims at can be realized without the chaperone, right? This is, as I said, this is a non-controversial example of a ruling that has changed with the changing of the times. So, there was a time when this ruling was enforced very strictly. Woman cannot travel without a male to, chaperone her. Now, women have cell phone, 911. If something happens, the security places and airports, the relative safety of a woman can be ensured in that way. However, the basis, that women are subject to certain kinds of vulnerability that men are not subject to is still true, right? That's still true. That's not like the ruling has changed because there's a new way of protecting that objective, which is the security and protection of women. There's a new way of realizing that objective. The objective itself is still relevant. A woman is assaulted in this country every 3 minutes or every 30 seconds, that's still real. And some people would look at that, and just because it suggests a difference between the vulnerability of men to attack and assault and abuse and harassment, and women, that it's somehow a gender bias. Yes, but it's true. It's something that's true. Now, a more controversial example that you mentioned kind of in passing is like women marrying non-Muslim men and men marrying non-Muslim women. Now, the fact that in almost all articulations that I know, every articulation of Islamic law that I know, although I did hear an imam on the south side of Chicago saying that, and maybe women would like this, but maybe they wouldn't. There's an imam on the south side of Chicago who swears by his position, and he has teachers and everything, I believe he's Shi'i, that Muslim men cannot marry non-Muslim women. And that the verse in the Quran is only referring to those women's backgrounds. I mean, they can come from Christian backgrounds or Jewish backgrounds, but they cannot be Christian or Jewish at the time of the marriage. Where I would, as of course, my degree was in legal reasoning, and I'm an Islamic lawyer, essentially. Where I would push back is, then are you saying that Muslim men can, okay, so are you saying, so if you're saying that, so you're saying that Muslim men can marry women that come from Christian or Jewish backgrounds, but are not Christian or Jewish. Are you saying that Muslim women can marry men that come from Christian or Jewish backgrounds, but have to be Muslim at the time of the marriage? Because in the Quran, it says that Muslim women should marry Muslim men, or can Muslim women only marry Muslim men that come from Muslim backgrounds, right? Which for me as a convert, I could not marry a Muslim woman. That doesn't hold up. The strongest opinion is that a Muslim man, and by strongest I mean endorsed by the greatest number of scholars, a Muslim man can marry a Christian woman or a Jewish woman, but that same allowance is not extended to women. Now, there's a difference there. And that difference is based on gender. Now, if you look in the books, what they suggest is it would be the irresponsible jeopardizing. It would be to irresponsibly jeopardize a woman's ability to practice her deen by pairing her with a man who did not share her faith commitment. That's the basis of that ruling. Now, that ruling does have a certain assumption, a certain implication that whereas a man, if he's Muslim and his wife is not practicing Islam, she isn't Muslim, it entails no threat to his religious standing. It doesn't, she would not have authority over him in a way that she would be able to say, don't pray or don't fast or, go to church or, swear off your Islam or that. But it is implying that a Muslim woman would be in a position where her husband, if he wasn't Muslim, would be able to say, don't pray. Ramadan, I want to be with my wife today. There's not going to be any Ramadan. Don't fast. This is my son's christening. You're gonna be there, and you're gonna participate, and you're gonna wear this car. It would. Now, I know very many women that understand this historical basis, but they say, given where we are in terms of gender relations now, that a woman being with a non-Muslim man entails, an endanger kind of, her endangerment as a Muslim. It's just not true, babe. It's just not true. That my husband is just as capable of respecting my individuality and my choice as a Muslim as I would be of respecting his if I were Muslim and he was. And that my husband and I don't relate to each other in that way that this entails any my religion is not threatened by this, by having a man that isn't Muslim. And to that point, to that end, Khalid Abu al-Fadl, right, the scholar from UCLA, who is very progressive and very modern in his views, but no one can say that he's not learned, he's not erudite. I don't care. I met that man. I spoke with that man. I disagree with him on this, and I'll come to my position after this. I disagree with him on this, but he's a scholar of our legal tradition. He's a scholar, man. I spoke with him. He's a scholar. We met in Cairo shortly after I graduated, and when we were arguing about, not arguing, there is no argument between he and I because he's much more knowledgeable than I. But I was telling him about how I did not understand his position, that because of the gender difference not being as present in this time as the text suggests, he just thinks it's disliked, right? It's makruh. It's disliked for a Muslim man to marry a non-Muslim woman or for a Muslim woman to marry a non-Muslim man. But he says that it's not haram. It's not impermissible. Now, where I disagreed with him, I said, one, I think there's a lot more to the relationship of men and women to each other than our discussion is letting on. I don't think yes, maybe, I'm not even willing to say that this dominant, very toxically masculine, culture, you're going to do what I say. I'm not even going to say that doesn't exist anymore. I would not, I guess what I'm saying is that, as a man with two Muslim daughters who I aspire to become practicing, if they were going to be with men who were not practicing, even if he was, or who were not Muslim, even if he was saying, I totally respect her individuality, I respect her religion, I will facilitate the practice of her religion, the very fact that there is an inherent disparity in physical strength, it would still worry me. That would still worry me. That there is a disparity, at least in physical strength. You do have a certain power here that if you wanted to, given your spiritual state now, could be used to compel my daughters not to do something that God commanded of them. That actually still would scare me. Even if there were lots of assurances that would never happen. The second thing that for me is still concerning is perhaps perhaps God is suggesting that there is something between a man and a woman, that a woman in her kind of natural receptivity to her partner, and her kind of natural receptivity to her partner, a natural kind of, a sharing of energies, but a bouncing off of energy, right? That, there's certainly, speaking just anecdotally now, certainly between my wife and I, there's certainly a sharing of energies, right? She is into certain things, I get into them. But I will say that in certain places, I can definitely see that, she has kind of a leading energy that I follow. And in certain places, I have a leading energy that she kind of just very naturally just kind of falls into step with, just naturally, just because, we have deep affection for one another and deep care, deep concern. And in order for her to be my wife, she must trust me a great deal and trust my integrity, trust my morals, trust my good intentions. She must, I think, she has to, have a greater trust of my moral worthiness than I have to have of hers in order to be my wife, and in terms of me being her husband. She has to trust me more. And I think that added trust leads to a certain way that, there's a natural, help me out somebody, attractability, there's a natural following of, of a path that is tread by the man. And it doesn't, and I'm not talking about in any kind of draconian, these are my rules, my way. I'm talking about if rules are never verbalized, if those kind of things are never articulated, but kind of like, this is his way of doing things, I think that kind of naturally becomes, my way of doing things if I'm married to this person, potentially. So I guess I'm saying that to say, there is a gender difference there. Yeah, subhanAllah. There is a gender difference there that, if somebody took the position of Dr. Abu al-Fadl and was like, look, I think it's just makruh, or I think there's nothing wrong with it because the basis of the ruling is gender, and that understanding of gender does not exist in 2020, that would be between. They could make that choice, and I think they could make that choice with integrity. They can make that choice with integrity as a Muslim. I am not entirely convinced that this flattening of gender that is being mentioned here, that this all. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that that's. I'm not convinced that is accurate. This kind of flattening of gender in that way. So, but to my sister's point, I do think we still have to look at it. I think we have to look at it, and we have to dissect it and break it down and survey it, according to our knowledge of our society. So so on one point, totally agree. One point, me and you and I, because we've talked about this before, we might disagree. What I'm trying to lay out is that we can disagree with integrity as well. If you decided, look, I don't think the gender basis of the ruling is there anymore. I mean, I just told you one of the most knowledgeable Islamic legal scholars that I've had a chance to converse with, he had the position that, it's not haram. I don't agree with, I'm not convinced by his logic, but I know that, he's not trying to ruin Islam, or he doesn't really read the Quran, or he doesn't care about Islam, or he's not a real scholar, or I don't believe any of that. I just think in terms of our assessment of the facts of this ruling, we disagree. Run, I'm in the hot seat, man. What time is it? Okay, Masha, I got 10 minutes.
I don't want to inadvertently usurp the conversation. I do have a follow-up question if no one else wants to speak up, but if someone does, please feel free.
Does anyone have a follow-up or? Okay, you're not usurping, mashallah.
No, I think your questions are amazing. I'm really enjoying it. And in my opinion, you're not usurping at all.
Okay, thank you. So I have a few follow-up questions, and I don't think any of them, I don't know if we'll have time to cover them in the next 9 minutes, but maybe we can continue with them next week. So I think, again, just based off of all of the great information we just received, I think it begs the question, we need to, let's get into like the basics of how these rulings are formed. And I don't intend to go on like a very dry, thick, heavy conversation, but I do think that we do need that edification. I know we've just briefly discussed this in the past, and you had mentioned the basis, a couple of different bases by which a ruling is examined and reviewed in our, in a modern context. And one of them was whether it withstands the test of time or whether it becomes an anachronism. And then the other one was it's because God says so, and that's the right way. And obviously I'm that's not verbatim, but I'm trying to figure out how our scholars use this. How do they determine which one applies? And maybe you can, give us an example of how that process works.
Usually, with very rare exceptions, if something is related to devotional acts, like prayer, for instance, the default is that this is something that is just from God, and our test is to adhere to it to show our devotion. The sunset prayer that we're all preparing to pray is 3 units of prayer. Why not 2? Why not 4? Why not 6? We don't know. The Prophet, peace be upon him, prayed 3. We emulate him. We pray 3. I said with rare exceptions, sometimes whenever money is involved, like zakat, for instance. You have the zakat that we pay at the end of Ramadan. It's called zakat al-fitr. We pay it every year. It's actually specified, that this should not be money, but it should be food, right? It's actually mentioned like explicitly. This should be paid in food. This should be paid in grain. It's mentioned explicitly, kind of in the tradition. And you'll find some hardliners that will come to the mosque with rice and corn. It's very embarrassing. Just kidding. It's very embarrassing. But because a ruling like that involves money, almost 70, no more than that, 85 and 90% of the scholars, they say it's not, yes, food is mentioned explicitly, but if we find that money is more, it lends itself more to ighna'ul faqir, enriching the indigent, then we should give money instead of food. We abandon the traditional ruling, the hadith. We don't abandon it, but we attenuate it for our context. Like he said, give food, but really, in our time, in our society, impoverished people would actually benefit more from money than food, right? But that's rare. Usually in devotional acts, we adhere to, the law to the letter. In worldly transactions, right? Marriage, divorce, business, contracts, etc. The general rule is that these are things that should stand the test of time. These are things that have clear, discernible rationales. They're not just for nothing. If something is mentioned as like this is how it's done, or this is the way it should be done, or this is what should be done. If it's a worldly transaction, it's understood that this is being mentioned for a reason. There's a reason that this is being mentioned. This is not just being mentioned for, because God said. This is being mentioned. This is being mentioned for a reason. So, like the first example I gave, women traveling with chaperones. No one says we do it just because God said. No, we do it for protection. It's clear. What's the reason for that protection? Or, if two people are doing a long-term contract of any sort, that contract would be witnessed by people, right? Actually witnessed by, this is where one man or two women. Both the witnessing is for the purpose of, verification, of the contract. If we're able to do that through just a lawyer or through, a contract and it being notarized or something of that sort, then that's a way that can be done. Similarly, if we said two men for one woman, or two women, for one man, it does not in any way indicate that one man is worth two women. That could never be true. What it indicates is that in that society, the strength of women's witness was doubted because women were assumed to know less about business contracts. They were assumed to know less. So if two people are in a contract dispute and a woman steps forth and says, no, the terms were actually this, it would give one of the disputants the ability to say, she's a woman, how does she know? Women don't do this often. He would argue that there's more chance for errancy because she's not familiar. She doesn't know business. How does she know? But if there's two women that say, no, we both saw this, then the Quran is saying what? That has the evidentiary value of the witness of one man. Now, in our society, I would argue this is a place where the gender difference has been replaced by meritocratic difference. Whereas if she is a lawyer, then her witness is worth more than two, non-professionals. You see, so I would say in our context, the witness of one professional woman that knows contracts, mergers, acquisition is worth four men that don't. Because the thing there is evidentiary value. You see, evidentiary value. And all scholars can agree to that. You see, those are, I think, those are two examples of kind of the difference in those rulings, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Wow, man, this was a good start, to this series. I hope people appreciate it. What's next? Where should we stay here? Should we keep going? What are you thinking for next week? Because I hadn't thought of I figured that this would be directed by the class. I hadn't thought of you know, a whole course. But I thought this would be directed by the class.
I'd love to stay with this for another class. I don't know if anyone else agrees or disagrees with that.
Okay. Okay. Does anyone else have any feedback?
Well, there was also, it's along the same lines as somebody requested for the Ansari woman and their take on Islam. So that might be something to also pair with this conversation.
Okay. Inshallah. So we'll pick up from there next week, inshallah. Sound good?
So
Yes.
good. Thank you so much. This is a great class. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمين يا رب العالمين.